Damiano Cerrone is an urbanist and co-founder of Spin Unit, an urban research and innovation practice, and Urbanist AI, a participatory design platform reimagining the future of cities. He conducts research on multi-species planning at Tampere University and the Estonian Academy of Arts. His work focuses on urban research and policy design for both local and national governments. In addition, he teaches and collaborates with academic institutions in Europe and internationally. So, with this all said, I want everyone to give an applause to Damiano. And now I'm passing the mic to him. So, thank you so much for being here, Damiano. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you. Pleasure's mine. Uh, Here. Right. So, as you mentioned, indeed, like I've been involved in the academic research as well in practice, so in consulting, working with cities and ministry. And the story of how I ended up in working with parking reforms actually come from the academia. Um, for almost 13 years now, I've been basically working on strategic fundings given by the Ministry of Finland to work on so-called strategic questions, so questions and issues that affect the life of people in Finland. And in this research, basically what we have found with a cohort of 22,000 children across Finland, and one of the main results was actually that children living in the countryside and in area with high biodiversity, they had a much stronger immune system and they were less likely to develop non-communicable diseases. On the contrary, basically children that were growing in cities were actually more exposed and more likely to develop non-communicable diseases, or the onset of the disease would come much earlier. So clearly, we found an association between land use and public health, which is quite striking. And to see if it really had to do with the land. For the past 3 years now, we've been running experiments where we've actually transformed daycares by removing sand and grass and replacing it with peat and sort of soil from the countryside and from the forest. And just after 28 days, we would take blood samples of those children and swabs of their skin. And we found out indeed that is the issue. It really is about the land itself, because after 28 days, there was an increase in those kind of blood kind of a blood marker that usually protect the body against autoimmune disease, and also the skin microbiota and the gut microbiota were actually so much stronger and so much more protective towards diseases. So basically, sort of this is where I come from this sort of academic perspective, and I try to bring this into cities. So what this has to do with parking places, at least for me, it's all about parking places. Because when we look at cities, we need to find places to increase biodiversity. It's quite straightforward to say that we need to increase biodiversity because it's better for us as humans as well. But where do we find the space? How can we increase canopy cover in cities? How can we increase permeable land in cities? Well, then we need to go to municipalities and convince them to find the space. And the low-hanging fruit is parking. It is parking because at least in Europe, we are still stuck with very old parking mandates. So we still have about 1.5 parking spaces per flat. So most of the mandates are per flat, especially here in Northern Europe. And as I said, the average is 1.5. So even if you are building a block of flats for students, of which maybe only 1 out of 10 is a car, um, well, you still need to build hundreds and hundreds of parking places. And of course, the cheapest place, it's the open land. This is an example from a museum in Estonia, where this is what you usually see there. It's a museum that anyway cannot host more than 20 people at a time, but there is like 30 parking places. So I will show you a bit of a few examples from the cities that we've been working with. So Tampere is up there in central Finland, Tallinn, Pärnu, and Tartu down there in Estonia. So just to give you a bit of a geographic reference of the places we're speaking about here. I wanted to show you some very practical examples, kind of showing you really what the numbers are, because these are very interesting to me. Here we have Tampere. This is the city with one of the best and most profound biodiversity policies. Also because it's our kind of a case city. So our national research fundings, they are basically focusing on the city of Tampere and Helsinki. So we've been in touch with the city for like more than 10 years now. And they have a biodiversity policy called LUMO program. And then Helsinki even has a multi-species planning program. So a way to do urban planning in which not only humans are first, but also other species come into the picture. But what you're seeing here is that even a city with one of the most advanced biodiversity-based policies and the support of the university for over 10 years, still today, if we're looking at what surrounds the building in the city, the majority of the building in the city center, as you can see by the color, they're surrounded by 80% of impermeable land. So it's just asphalt and other buildings. It's quite a striking number also if we start to see how many people live in those buildings. So what you see with those, this is the same map, but just on a grid cell. What you see with these black squares, actually, it's the highest concentration of population compared to the national standard of Finland. So what it's kind of showing us is that almost on the national level, here in Tampere, the highest concentration of human beings happens to be in the same place where there is the lowest concentration of greenery. So literally going against all our policies and ideas that we've been developing in the past 10 years. So this is quite important because if we now move to other cities like Tallinn, we can see that parking is one of the best resources that we have. So when we started to work on parking reforms for those cities, so we have done a parking reform on each of those cities, and in most of them they were already approved. Here in Tallinn, it really was about, first of all, about mapping parking spaces. This is something that almost no city actually has. They don't have a map. They only have address point. So they know that there is a parking place there for 5 cars, but it's never mapped. Nobody knows the actual surface. So go there, map them one by one, and then exactly start to create these high resolution maps where we start to see then how much space is dedicated to people and how much space is dedicated to cars. Same story here. Most buildings have between 30 and 50% of land surrounding them, which is basically streets and parking lots. But the beautiful thing is that actually, especially in Estonia, we have extremely accurate occupancy data because nearly 90% or even a bit more than 90% of the parking is done through mobile apps. And the city can collect all this data into one big Excel sheet and we can analyze it. So what happens here is that we can see actually, even though there is a lot of parking space, this parking space is not used efficiently. So because efficiently means that there is at least 80% occupancy all the time. But what we see is just the opposite. The maximum is like 75%, and it happened only one day a week. So what does it mean? It means that there is space to reduce parking areas. I'm not going to tell you anymore about how complex it is to go through these data sets because we literally have each single payment. So we're talking about millions of rows. But it's very interesting because since we have the single payments, we can even follow the driver. We can see, okay, this person has parked 2 hours in this district and 2 hours in these other districts. And the most alarming thing we keep on finding in these cities is that people use the car massively to do like 500-meter trips. Because what they do is they go to the office in the morning, and then maybe from the office they go and get lunch some other place. And then after the lunch, they come back to the office, and then from the office, they go maybe to the shopping center and then home. So they use a lot the cars for this kind of a short movements. However, of course, like parking place is still profitable. So what we managed to do in Tallinn is that we managed to capture the land acquisition price. So we knew the sort of the parking operator for how much they've bought the land, and then we simply divide that by the number of cars that can host. And with an average 40% occupancy that we've seen there, actually it takes less than a year to repay that investment. So this is one of the reasons why you see parking places everywhere, at least here in the Nordic countries, um, because even in city center, land is relatively inexpensive. So generally, like you would end up paying between $6,000 and $8,000 per parking place, basically, when you buy the land. So you can repay it extremely quickly. Um, so eventually what it means that if we start to count basically how many parking places there are per flat on average, so not what the law is telling us it should be, but what the reality is. Again, by neighborhood in Tallinn, we see that the average it's kind of 1.5. So there is about 1.5 parking space per flat, which is actually extremely high even for a small city in Estonia. How the parking reform was then structured, it was structured based on mobility. So what we've done is that we've done a quite complex analysis to create this kind of a map that shows the area within kind of basically it's the area where public transit is fast, efficient, and affordable, which means that if you live inside this red area, you don't need a car. And the parking reform that was passed, it was to put a parking cap, not anymore by building, but by area. So what the city have decided to do, they have decided to take our advice, and within this red area, of course, it's a bit larger. This is kind of this is the detailed map, but they have redrawn this by hand to make it a bit more round. Within this area, no parking place can ever be built anymore. So it's like a parking cap to the whole zone. So anyone who wants to build or renovate a building in this area shall not build any new parking place. How it's going to go, I don't know, because it was approved a year ago. So we will see what kind of how it's going to play out in the next years. But this also came together with another normative that we have designed for the city of Tallinn, which is the green factor. So within that area, you could not build any new parking places, but then within the whole city of Tallinn, whenever somebody has to build something new or renovate an existing building, it must provide by law 30%, 30% kind of a, well, 0.3 green factor, which actually means that 30% of the lot must be dedicated to impermeable surfaces. More or less, because the green factor can be multiplied. So you can also get a 0.3 factor if you only have 20% unbuilt area, but you make it very lush and you put like trees that produce food and so on. So there is a way to tweak this green factor. But just to say that it's not only about parking, you need to balance it out with something else as well. This is the reason, because like if the goal is to increase biodiversity in cities, you cannot be stuck just to normative. Okay, 20%, 30% is green. You actually need to have a system that sort of takes into account the quality of that green space. And you can see here an example of two lots with the same green factor, but the one on top, basically, it's almost sterile in terms of biodiversity, and the one in the bottom is actually extremely biodiverse because it has both trees that produce fruits, flowers, and also vegetables that can be picked in the summer. And in some cities, they went a bit extreme, which is actually a really good idea, which is to say there is no normative at all. So you don't have a parking norm. We only say that you gotta have at least 60% of impermeable surfaces, and then the rest you deal with it yourself based on supply and demand. So you just try to calculate what is the demand for parking areas, and then you derive it from that. So as far as you provide 60% of impermeable area, the city is happy with that. And I think this is the approach that we have actually suggested then to other cities in the future. This is the case of Malmo. Now, back to Estonia, let's look at Tartu. Tartu is the university city, so it's plenty of students, so you would expect less cars, which is kind of true. But then again, when you look at land use, it's still the same issue. What this graph is showing you, with the black, you see the amount of kind of the share of streets and parking spaces. And with the orange, you see the total net area of residential space. So in Estonia, there is very accurate data of how much space for each function there is inside the buildings. So this is the sum, it's not the footprint of a residential building, it's how much residential area there is inside buildings. And what it kind of shows you is that on average, there is more than 3 times the space dedicated to cars than for basically people to live. Um, and this is kind of a quite interesting because the reason why we don't often manage to convince politicians to, change to make a new parking reform is because it's very difficult for them to really understand these kind of proportions. Like when we present this map to politicians, they immediately we see them changing their mind. That's why whenever we do these kind of studies in every city, we try to create this map because when they see that, them as mayors, they're basically giving to their residents 3 times more space for cars than for them, it becomes kind of it becomes a new conversation, it's a new narrative. So what this map shows you here, just look at this kind of a bottom left part of the graph. It shows you basically that, so on average, there is 30 square meters, yeah, see residential area here in the orange. There is basically, at least in this city, there is 30 square meters per person of, exactly as I said, of residential space within the buildings, which just makes sense because the average flat size is like 70 square meters, and usually there is 2 to 3 people in them. So 30 square meters per person, but then there is 25 square meter per person of parking area. So there is almost the identical share of land for cars than for people. And then, of course, if you sum up the roads, then it goes to 60. 60 plus 25. So you have 3 times more, as I mentioned also before, you have 3 times more space for parking and roads than for living, which is quite striking. So this has been sort of our way also to go and talk to mayors and say, not every project is necessary, even when it's done for the good. This is the case where in this city there was a strong movement to increase, cycling and walking. But what has resulted into even less space for biodiversity. So this massive infrastructure of bike lane and pedestrian path has actually decreased even more the space for nature, which is essential for humans. So sometimes good intention can produce also this kind of questionable outcome. But back to the parking itself, another map that we try to show. So because we really need to build narrative. What we noticed is that if we want to convince mayors and vice mayors to change their policies, the data in itself, it's not as important as the narrative in which you wrap it within. So other thing we did is to show how many cars were parked in the city. So we have literally mapped using satellite images each single car that was parked within the municipal borders. And then we counted from data set that we had how many flats there are. And it came out that even in such a small city, there were more cars parked than flats are available. So there were 41,000 cars against 37,000 flats. So this again, it's a striking story to tell to politicians because like it becomes so much more difficult for them then to push policies that goes like for the increase of parking places. That's why like sometimes um, those cities are not very happy to work with us because we create this kind of narrative which are very difficult for politicians to escape, let's say. And also what was quite striking actually is that if you map the parking spaces and the drivable surfaces in which cars have to maneuver, on average, at least in this city, but we've seen the same in other cities was almost the same, almost identical. There would be about 62 square meters per car. Maybe somebody might need to help me to make this in square foot because I believe most of you are in US but I hope that you get a bit kind of the ballpark of these numbers. Yes. So, but again, here was the same story that like the average occupancy was far below 80%. Again, this is huge data set, but this column here shows you the kind of average occupancy rate, and it's also actually usually like 50 to 60%. So what the policy in this case was, in Tallinn was about mobility. So basically no parking places where public transport is present. Here was more about reducing everywhere you could. So because the parking kind of occupancy was so low that we had enough number to say that, we can reduce, car dependencies by 10%, and that would be enough to still guarantee 80% occupancy and build all those projects that you see here. So we have literally mapped each single space that could be sort of reclaimed from parking spaces. And you could literally build 5 schools, uh, 5 parks. Um, so it's kind of, and all those like, bus stops, 10 bus stops, 10 kiosks, 10 small park for children. So the numbers are incredible. And the city now is implementing also this norm. They won't be able, of course, to do this so quickly. The scenario is by 2040. But let's say that also this was kind of, so far it's been accepted. And now the last one, which is Perno. In this city, we've seen again the same story. When we map the parking places and the residential area, there is still 3 times more parking space than residential space. And what's interesting here, though, is that it's a touristic city, and they thought that they could afford to increase the parking fee to like €5 per hour, which is a lot. It's like $5 per hour. In a city of this kind, it really is a lot. And what happened actually here is that people started then to convert these beautiful kind of green backyards. Oh, my screen went off. Just let me change this. Anyway, they started to convert those beautiful backyards into parking spaces, which is horrible. So they started to destroy basically what we were supposed to preserve, which is the biodiversity of the city. So sometimes increasing kind of parking fees without a proper study actually can cause even more harm. And you can see also here on the left, you have a kind of a time limited parking place, which is basically empty. And then on the right hand side, somebody has just destroyed this green area to make a cheap parking space for kind of a long-term parking. So this is why actually this is what kind of convinced them the city to sort of hire us and make these kind of studies, because somebody started to notice that basically just increasing prices is not a solution. Like you need to actually understand what's going on. Everybody was against our, as usual, everybody was against our ideas to reduce parking spaces because it would destroy the commerce of the city. But again, in Estonia, there is so much data. So what we did is that we've taken all the revenue actually of every business in the country is it's a public data set. So we can basically see each business how much money is making or losing. And we've mapped the revenue of the businesses against the footprint of the amount of parking space around them. And basically there was no correlation at all. So if having parking space near your business would actually increase your revenue, you would see all these dots crowded around that line, but we don't see anything of that at all. So to conclude, basically the parking normative in this case was really about convincing them to, first of all, drop the parking fees. Otherwise, people would keep on destroying green areas to park the car for free. But most importantly, it was to redefine the area in which no parking places should be built again. And we used a kind of this approach where basically it's a performance-based normative and pricing, but performance stands for the ability of the city to offer different services. So for example, can you reach an office within walking distance? Can you reach an hospital within walking distance? Somebody called it a 15-minute city policies, but it's not, because actually also kind of we have different kind of radiuses for each activity. So if kind of, for example, like shopping center, they don't need to be within 15 minutes walk, right? So we have basically for each of those categories, with the city, we have decided different distances. But the long story short, again, is that we have exactly these kind of maps that shows you kind of from which are the areas from where you can reach certain services. And then we combine them into one single map that shows you basically with the green color, these are all the plots. Basically, that if you live in the green area, you don't need a car because you can reach nearly everything in a walking distance. So then the idea is that we take this area and that becomes the new kind of a zone for the parking normative and the pricing model. So then the pricing model is so that the higher is the accessibility to services, the higher is the price of parking spaces. Yeah, so on the left, you see the previous zone, the paid parking zone, and then on the right-hand side, the new parking zones. So this was basically everything I wanted to show you. So very practical examples with kind of some numbers that I think would make us think quite a lot. But I don't have yet the approval on this because this is this parking normative. It's waiting for the new mayor to come in, which is in a couple of weeks. So we don't know yet if it's gonna just remain a suggestion or if the new mayor is going to approve it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for the presentation. That was great. We've got some time to take questions. We don't have a ton of participants here, so you can either type a question in the chat, or you can just use Zoom's hand raise feature, or I think even just unmute yourself. With only about 10 people here, that should be fine. If it becomes a problem, then we'll use the hand raise. But anyone have a question for Damiano to kick things off? If
Daniel, I do.
Go ahead, please.
So last night I was at a conversation about autonomous vehicles, and one of the speakers was a mayor of one of our suburbs. And of course, she brought up the fears of all of the cars coming to her precious suburb because the demand would be downtown, but all the space would be in the suburbs. And so I wonder how the play between demand for people having their cars outside of the center city versus where they expect to have the same privileges of free parking or parking availability at any cost in the central city, where your work is suggesting that no, that's not what is the best priority or the best use of our limited space.
Yes, so this is one of the main issue also, or even maybe especially in those cities, because in Estonia, basically the country saw that it has basically just 3 cities, and those 3 cities are like 50% of the population. So everybody who doesn't live in this city works in those cities. So the majority of those cars are actually commuters. The only thing, so from the suburbs, basically. So cities are very small and compact, and suburbs are extremely spread out. The main thing that has been tested, I mean, that we not tested, but the main thing that we wanted to actually to apply is the famous gates at the city center. So if your car, if your registration plate, you can just like scan it. If you're not from this zone, you pay an entrance fee. This is something that we've always suggested and never managed to actually implement. This is the most difficult thing to implement actually because the politicians themselves live in the suburbs. So they don't want to pay €5 or $5 every day to drive in. So this is one of the main issues, and this is the best solution. And we know that from Sweden, because Sweden has been actually brave enough to apply this policy. So Stockholm, Gothenburg, a lot of cities in Sweden, they have gates. In Gothenburg, it's about €1.50, which is like $2. So whenever you go in and out, you pay $2. And that's been kind of their way to solve this issue, if I understood correctly what you were basically asking me. But yes. And so whether the car is autonomous or not, at that point, it doesn't matter exactly. And this is also one big problem here in Europe, is that there is a strong incentive for electric vehicles and then in the future also autonomous vehicles. So at least right now, the main policy is that those cars do not pay for parking even in paid areas, which is horrible because basically what starts to happen, especially in these small cities, is that people that come from the countryside who can afford a Tesla, they drive in and pay and don't pay for parking. So this has been also in all these 3 policies. One of our main suggestions is it doesn't matter if the car is self-driving or is fully electric. it's still taking the same, if not more, amount of space because these cars are growing huge. So fortunately, this has been accepted, but most cities, they would not do it until 2030, they say. So like even Tallinn and Pärnu, they say, yeah, we accept the idea, but for the next 5 years, we must keep it for free, kind of.
I'm interested. So I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about the parking caps you were talking about. That's an approach we really don't see much at all in North America, but where it's not at the property level, but at the district level, you kind of have a maximum amount of parking. How that's administered in practice, how difficult is it for the local authorities to track what they need to track in order to actually implement that? Can you talk
Right.
about that?
Actually, yeah, this we made the suggestion because at least for the Estonian system, this was the easiest policy for cities to implement and track. Because the way it works in Estonia is that whenever you want to build something new or whenever you want to renovate also an existing building, you need to have, of course, like a permit. And when you bring up that permit, then you need to negotiate with the city exactly how many parking places and so on. So it's just very simple. So that you bring up your permit, and if it says we're going to add 5 parking places, the city says no, you don't. Unless, of course, there is no parking place at all on the street, like that, there must be some kind of conditions met. But in that sense, it was kind of a very straightforward, and actually developers, at least here, they are happy not to build parking spaces because in dense urban environment, it means building them underground, which is, it costs around $25,000 per car per place. So the developers, well, actually the reason why we managed to pass also those kind of reforms, which are quite radical for the local context, is that in both cases, we gathered letters of support from the construction sector and from property owners, property developers. So basically, when we went to the city and said, "Hey, like you can implement this reform," the answer would be, "Oh yeah, but like nobody would want to do that." And then we show, actually, no, look, there is like 200 signatures that the private sector is more than happy because they can make so much higher revenue actually on selling their property. So the only issue it still is the shopping centers. They didn't sign that letter. Like they still strongly believe that they need an excessive, like they want to give the impression that there is always a parking space. So they usually build 30 to 40% more than it's actually required because they want to make sure that even at full capacity, there is free parking spaces.
Yeah, we hear that anecdotally about retail chains here too. That there's some research that a parking lot that is 70% occupied, to the casual passerby sort of scans as full. So they try to create that buffer. But in terms of the district level cap, is there then sort of a tradable market in parking, rights between private property owners? Will they make agreements with each other to I'm going to redevelop some of my parking, so now you can build some parking. I don't know if you see anything like that happen, like cap and trade for parking spaces, I guess.
No, what I'm seeing, it's this we're not seeing this. Like what we've seen actually is more that the shopping centers owners that exactly they have this extra capacity, then they are more interested like to bring then those extra sort of this new kind of these incoming new drivers in their kind of a paid parking area. So for them also it's a business opportunity because especially in city center, of course, those shopping centers, they have the underground parking, which is very expensive, or they have parking houses. So basically what we've been doing is that we've been mapping also the occupancy rates of those to prove that actually there is space. So even if you're going to build here a new kind of a block of flats, you can have an agreement with the nearby shopping center to have kind of a long-term stay and things like that. So this is also how it's been traded in that sense that of course, there's more stakeholders involved, but well, it's better for the health of the city.
Um,
Yep. yeah, one of the main other thing that we are noticing is that the private parking operators, they're very happy with us and with Donald Trump kind of ideas, because like you would always think that they are not, leaning on that political side of the world, but actually for them, having sort of having less parking spaces, it means they can increase the price per hour, right? So that they actually like scarcity. So that's why it's been actually really good for us to have also the support of sort of a kind of a private parking operators, because of course it's in their interest to have more scarcity. Yeah.
Anyone else have a question they'd like to ask?
So in your description of the different parking conditions, is there um, a quality issue, and how should we address that when we have private property rights and different people having different priorities for how they're going to use their land, and we can't control how parking is charged or not charged on private property?
Right. So, well, at least in Estonia, you are free to do so. So in Estonia, you can just decide it's 5 euros per hour, it's 20 euros per hour. There is no regulation. So also in Finland, Sweden, so there is no, the city doesn't have a say on what you do on private land. And that's exactly why it's been actually like very well supported by the private sector, both the construction and kind of the parking space kind of a managers, because for them scarcity means they can just put whatever price. I mean, they can really like then do the sort of a demand-based pricing. So maybe it's a bit different context. But in general, sort of the interesting thing is that the conditions that we've been kind of analyzing, they've been defined, and because as you said, it's about quality as well. It's not just about quantity. We have been defining all of these through sense-making sessions where we had the cities representatives, we have politicians, we have property developers, and the construction sector. So in all of those three projects, we had several sense-making sessions with 40 to 50 participants from all these sectors. So the study I've been showing to you right now and the conditions sort of of those reforms, they have been, if you want, co-designed through those sense-making sessions. So that's also what we found quite useful, not to just go there as researchers and say this is the best solution, but rather welcome everybody in kind of at the city hall. Okay, now we have 3 hours to understand what those conditions are, and then understand also what the possibilities are and so on. So yeah, I would say this has been the best thing of those projects, because if you invite people at the very beginning, you get not only a lot of ideas, but you also really understand what's the meaning behind the data that you analyze.
I'm curious if you could speak a little more about, you talked about private property owners being very on board with sort of Schupian ideas, and actually benefiting from scarcity because they can, yeah. In terms of the public realm, do you see what kind of adoption do you see by local governments in the region of market-based, performance-based pricing? And I'm also curious about innovations that we've been pushing on this side of the Atlantic, like parking benefit districts, in terms of what you do with that revenue. What's the adoption like of those things? What are the politics around it?
So the parking benefit districts actually, it's at least in Estonia, in Tallinn, it was very much liked, and it was part of the suggestion is that you utilize the income from use parking revenues back into the system, back into the neighborhood. That is very liked because in Tallinn at least you actually have elected representatives by districts, so it's good for them, right? Because they have money to implement projects. In Finland, not, because you don't have elected representatives for districts. So the city doesn't really see the benefits of, actually they see the opposite. They see that if you distribute the revenue of, parking revenues in the district that generated them, you actually might end up with inequality of, of the projects, in the sense that basically, let's say the city center makes a lot of revenue, so it has more money to improve public space. Other neighborhoods which are already troubled, if you want, they have much less revenue, and so they have kind of they have less money to invest in the neighborhood. So these kind of disparities will be even more pronounced. So basically, so let's say in Finland they are sort of, if you want, against because of this narrative, while in Estonia they were kind of a pro because it makes the local representative look good. And then the first question was about the private sector.
Market-based pricing or performance-based pricing.
Yeah, so
in the public sector.
Yeah, again, but private sector is really on board with that. The city has two issues. One is that they don't have a way to monitor performance. So, of course, they could, because I did it with the data that they gave to us. It's just, it means that for them, they need to be able to build an infrastructure that would enable them to look at the parking occupancies like on 6 months basis or 12 months basis. So for them, it's kind of a relatively big investment to build the infrastructure to monitor performance. But so number one, while the private sector is fully built because they monitor it in real time. So for the private sector, they're totally on board because, the more money we can make, the better, and the system is already enabled. The other issue is, there are two issues. One is that in Estonia, actually, I know it sounds weird, but that's how it is. Um, publicly owned paid parking spaces and curb spaces are actually managed by the same companies that run the private parking spaces. So what they do is they do like a bid, right? So they say, okay, we have, I don't know, 25,000 paid parking spots in the city. And the private parking operators that can guarantee us the most wins the bid. So basically the city owns, because it's public land, so it owns the parking spot, and it also decides what is the hourly rate. But then the parking operator, which is the one that basically ensures that the fees are paid, and so the parking operator is private and is chosen based on how much money is given to the city at the end of the month. So it's kind of weird actually, because also the private parking operator doesn't actually have power to change the pricing. So then the only way basically for private parking operators to make a city happy and win the bid is that they collect a lot of fines. So the private parking operators actually they bet on people not paying the parking, so that they can issue a lot of fines. Because basically, so the way it works, they need to guarantee something like 200,000 euros a month to the city, and then they can keep everything else that is left. That's kind of how it works. So this is the other issue. So it's for the city, it's like they're a bit lazy. They feel that, okay, we don't really know how to operate. We don't really know how to manage our own properties. So we give it to somebody, and we just say whoever is guaranteeing us the most monthly income gets it. And then if they make money or not is not our problem. So that's also kind of a funny situation in Estonia. That's why the city doesn't even have the data, and they don't know. They don't even have a map of parking places because somebody else it's doing the operations, it's doing the maintenance, and so on.
Yeah, I can see that creates a strange incentive system there too. We're about 50 minutes in here. I want to make sure if we have any other audience questions that we get to those. Anybody
I
else
have a question. Yes.
Please.
But this has to do more with, I know, Damiano, that you have research on multi-species justice,
Mhm.
and I know that Estonia has a lot of data. So I'm wondering if you have like fresh data or a report or something, and how parking affects like insects or plants, like native plants, or I mean, of course, it takes like habitat, and but I don't know if the actual parking creates something else, or yeah.
So not parking directly, sort of, because basically, kind of the most of the studies they focus on analyzing the effects on biodiversity on private and public spaces. What I mean by that is that, like, exactly, we either see studies done on, exactly, on the daycares or schools, universities, university campuses, um, or in private spaces. And the way we do that in private spaces is actually is that we look at uh, when people return home. When you come back home, you bring home everything you stepped on with your shoes. So what we do actually, the way we map how much biodiversity people kind of are in touch with, is that we collect their doormats and see what's in the doormat. So we do this kind of a shotgun DNA test to see, kind of to sample what kind of animals or plants they've been basically in touch with. So
Wow.
we don't really know like exactly how much a parking place is affecting the biodiversity in the city, but we do see that people living in this area where there is a lot of parking spaces and a lot of like street kind of environment, they're not bringing much at home, let's say.
Okay. Interesting. Thanks.
Which is also an issue if you live in Nordic countries where there is a lot of snow. So also we see that the more up north you live, the more snow cover there is. So the less biodiversity you bring home because you are never touching the soil. You're just touching frozen water. So that was also like interesting that the incidence of these non-communicable diseases was correlated to also to the amount of or the opposite, it was correlated to the lack of biodiversity brought back in. So people that live north were more likely to develop non-communicable disease than people living in the south.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of scary though, but yeah, it is interesting. But when we're looking at the results, I was a bit like, because also now I have a young baby, and then you really think about it because here it snows a lot where I live. So and the idea is that you should be. That's why, like in Finland, there are quite a few companies that they create those indoor um, kind of a indoor wall that are able to actually create this kind of a more biodiverse environment. And also one outcome of our research was that pharmaceutical companies, they started to create those creams. One is called Moi Forest. I can also write it here if you're curious. Moi Forest. So what they do is that we basically the researchers from our team, they came up with what is the good composition of biodiversity, and then they literally pack it into a cream. And also, even I'm using it for our baby because he doesn't get exposed to anything. So you're literally spreading mud on your children so that at least they get something. Because if you live in a city and there is no, they don't get exposed almost to anything.
Wow. Well, I didn't know about that.
It's
Thanks, Damiano.
interesting one, yeah.
We're just about at our time here. I think we could take a last question if anyone has one, or if not, Paolo, we could wrap things up, you think?
Yeah, I think if no one else has another question, maybe we will wrap the event. Okay. So, well, I think I'm going to wrap up. Interrupt me if someone has a question, like just unmute themselves. Okay, well, this was a very interesting and insightful event, Damiano. So thank you so much. And in behalf of the Partner Reform Network, we appreciate your time and all the insights that you brought to us. So thank you so much.